Hello friends, welcome to FUSION24, welcome to the Information Age Gallery here at the Science Museum. Congratulations for finding it. Famously one of the best hidden bits of the museum. In between our sessions today, if you're spending time in this gallery, I thoroughly recommend the game, I used to have one of those, which you can play with personal computers over there or with mobile phones over there. All the things that you're like, oh yeah, that's in the bottom drawer of the second bedroom. I haven't touched it since 2008. The Science Museum have got one. Welcome to the first session here in the Information Age Gallery. My name's Steve Cross. Hello to the online people. People in the room, the camera for the online people is at the back. Would you all mind just turning around and giving them a wave to say hello? Hello, online people. See how friendly the in-the-room people are. I'm just here to introduce the host of our first session. Our first session is Maximising Opportunity, Ensuring Safety, looking at regulation in fusion around the world. And your host for this session is the wonderful Linda Nyberg. Linda is the Chief Communications Officer of Novatron, and she was very keen to tell me that Novatron is the only Nordic fusion power enterprise. So all the other Nordic countries, come on, pull your finger out. It's time to get involved. Can I please have a huge... Now, one thing I need to tell you is I'm a stand-up comedian, right? So when I introduce people, I am used to you all clapping a lot. And if you don't clap enough, I will stop the event and I will make you do it again. So please, and when I say huge, I mean huge. Can I have a huge round of applause for Linda Nyberg?
Thanks, Steve. Thanks, Steve. Thank you. Wow, what a great introduction. You applauded me before I even worked. I love that, so I'm leaving now. I come from Novatron Fusion Group, Chief Communication Officer. We just heard Steve saying, only Nordic initiative. I got into the fusion industry 2.5 years ago, former science journalist, and I really believe all of us working with fusion, we work for mankind. And today, what is needed, and enabling safety was one of the two words that Steve said, and I think that's so important, but cooperation is crucial in order to make this happen, not just from us in the fusion industry. We need regulations, and I think everybody says yes to that in the panel. So give them a warm hand. We start with Richard Pearson, welcome up on stage. Sally Forbes, welcome up on stage. Sean Lynch and Mike O'Neill, please have a seat. Warm hands. That's great. You got the same kind of applause that I got from Steve. That's great. Well, good to see you. We actually had the chance, because we were late, we already finished the panel, right? We had a great discussion here for 15 minutes because we heard the elevator wasn't working either. So thank you. Big hand for you coming here. Hope you will find it worthwhile. If we start with, if you look at the title, it's Maximising Opportunity, Ensuring Safety. Why is that important, Richard?
So I think safety underpins everything that we're going to do in fusion. If we don't have safety as a foundation, we are not going to be able to move forward now or indeed in 10 years' time. I think we sit upon the precipice of an age of industrialization in fusion, whereby we're going to start seeing bigger, more powerful, more interesting machines developed across the sector. And what this is about, I think, where we're at the moment, is there's an opportunity to say, right, let's regulate this in the right way. I think the UK government's done a pretty good job of sort of setting out the stall and saying, we're going to take a risk-based approach here, and this is not a technology we've ever seen before. It's not like fission, it's not like solar, it's not like anything else. So let's start from a position of keeping it flexible to allow innovation right now, and then later on doing studies, informing regulation as we go along, as we learn more. So running experiments, speaking to different groups and saying, what can you tell us about tritium, for example, and how the fuel cycle works? What can you tell us about plasma operations? Where are the challenges within those? And then, yeah, informing regulation in a proper manner.
We spoke about earlier here before getting up on stage. I mean, it's really global interest right now. It's even speeding up because there are some achievements, developments we can read about in fusion globally. But if you just want to give a small elevator pitch on what you do, what Kyoto Fusion Engineering do, and why you're 1 out of 4 who's only known Japanese.
Yes, I'm the non-Japanese founder of the company, which if you catch me for a coffee or a beer perhaps later, I can tell you that fun story. It was actually in an elevator that I met my co-founder, but anyway, that's for another time. Yep. Simply, fusion star in a jar, companies like CFS are looking at the star predominantly right now and then working their way outwards. We're working on the jar. So if you think about this in the context of a car engine, you know, we say someone's going to build an engine, but they're going to need to fuel it, and they're going to need to take the exhaust gases away. In Fusion, you have to recycle those, put them back in, but then we've got to use things to produce energy, make materials that are going to go into what's called a blanket that sits around the reactor and so on. But that's what we do as an organization.
Sally Forbes, going on to you, and just to remind you guys, we're going to have a Q&A later. Online, I'll see your questions here, so if you have any questions for the Q&A session, put them in there now. Sally, we made Novatron Fusion Group an MOU with your organization just 2 weeks ago, and I know you work a lot with foreign companies. UK is a platform really for international fusion cooperation. Can you tell us why? Why is that important?
So, yes, I work for UKAEA, and regulation is going to be really important for the fusion industry. Fusion research has been a global effort and will need to be. You know, we just seen the first presentation this morning, literally a tour around the globe. So to get some kind of harmonisation in regulation is really important for that. And in my role as the Fusion Safety Advisor, we've been kind of looking at the science. As Richard just mentioned, we've got to have regulation that is proportionate to the level of hazards from fusion, which is quite different to fission. So there has been a journey in the UK. If you want me to explain what that journey's been. So fusion is already regulated. The UK Atomic Energy Authority at Culham has the jet and mast experiments. So we've been regulated as a radiological facility by the Health and Safety Executive and Environment Agency for many, many years. The journey started a few years ago with the premise of developing kind of designs for fusion power plant, which is why we're all here today. So there was an independent expert body called the Regulatory Horizons Council that did a study into what might be the appropriate type of regulation for fusion. Different hazards there, there's kind of high voltages, lasers, as we've heard about, many different things. Many of the plant will have tritium, which is a radioactive gas. So they were looking at kind of how, is it still fit for purpose to regulate as we have been doing in the past? Their conclusion from talking to many people and looking at many studies was yes, they think it is appropriate to continue with those regulators. So the government then consulted on that 3 years ago and looked at various different of regulations, safety, environmental, liabilities, waste and things like that, and made the decision from that consultation, taking into account everything that everybody said, that yes, the profile of a fusion plant is more like another energy kind of plant, more than a fission plant. So the kind of aspects they've got to consider is, as we've said, safety and environment are priority. We have to make sure there's public insurance and that. But we also want to make sure that regulation is pro-innovation, because we don't really know how fusion is going to develop. There are many different technologies doing that. But what we have done in the UK is legislate via the Energy Act last year to make it clear and to kind of clarify that fusion will not need to fall under nuclear regulations in the future. So it's been a long journey. The work that we did in my team, and I have some of them in my audience here, is to kind of do those studies and look at the studies of kind of the hazard potential of fusion to back up the science of that. So that's how we came to where we are in the UK.
Just one more question before we get to Sean. You have over 20 years experience from the nuclear industry, I mean, working with these kind of questions. Would you say, I mean, the need for speed is for new energy solutions. Fusion, all here hopefully thinks fusion is great. We don't have 20 years. What do you think is the most urgent speed up in regulations right now? Not just UK, but globally.
Yeah, I mean, there's not a huge amount that is needed really. Certainly in the UK, we have what's called a goal-setting framework, which means it's completely technology neutral. It doesn't specify what you have to have as your kind of engineered safety systems, for example. So really, I think it's just, it's understanding, it's building capability amongst those that will regulate to kind of show the differences to other technologies. So we've done a lot of work bringing people to Culham to kind of explain what fusion is. So I think capability and capacity around the world is going to be important to keep that speed up.
Sean, you don't disagree, do you? No.
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 I'll declare, you declare 2 years, I'll declare 6 months in Fusion.
Yeah.
So this is a bit of an education for me being here today. My background is major projects, so what I'm really interested in is how we take the science of what Fusion is and make it understandable and deliverable by supply chain and almost demystify. And I think regulation plays a massive role in that. And the comment that Sally made about us looking at consistent regulation across geographies, I think is so important. Because what we're doing there is we're enabling investment, because if investment is coming into the technologies, they can see a global market rather than a UK market or a US market. So they can think, actually, if we develop these technologies, we can see a large market. And I think the balance of regulation is so important, and that communication at all levels of our project delivery as well. I think it's really important that, you know, the people in the blue overalls that actually operate this equipment understand why things are regulated, so they understand the technology to a sufficient level. Why do I need to do it this way, and how does regulation keep me safe? Because that's what we're talking about here, and I wouldn't disagree with any of the comments about fission is different from us in Fusion, and we need to be careful. And I think the fact that the UK has gone down the route of HSE and the Environment Agency as their regulators rather than the ONR, I think is a hugely positive step.
Mike, fusion energy lawyer. I just said, well, my company probably need one soon. Can you just, fusion energy lawyer, how did you end up specializing in fusion?
Well, my origin story is not that interesting in that, like every lawyer, I'm looking to be the best in the world at something, and it's easiest to be best if you're only. So some years ago, I was looking around.
I hope there's some students here, career tips. Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay, yeah.
Some years ago, I was looking for emerging areas, and I'd always lightly followed fusion as a, at the time, somewhat fanciful market. And then in late 2017, I was at an event where an MIT scientist named Dennis White described the Spark project and he said, watch this space for the next 90 days. And about 95 days later, Commonwealth Fusion Systems spun out of MIT to develop Spark and then the follow-on ARC program. And I cold emailed the CFS website and said, are you all thinking about how this is going to be regulated? Because it's going to be super complicated. And they said, we think about that a lot. Why don't you come in and talk to us about it? So that was the entry point for my work in Fusion. And it actually, somewhat serendipitously, coincided with the US development of a regulatory framework for Fusion, somewhat spurred along by congressional action with the so-called NEMA, Nuclear Energy Innovation and Modernization Act, setting a timeline for the US Nuclear Regulatory Commission to establish a framework to regulate fusion. I actually don't know if it was inspired by the work in the UK, but it certainly coincided and was contemporaneous with a lot of the early actions that Sally was describing with the Regulatory Horizons Council, prodding things along. And so right now, the US is deep within the regulatory process in a similar way that the UK has progressed, you know, with somewhat the expert agencies describing the hazard and operating scenarios and evaluating the appropriate risk. The NRC last year decided that fusion ought not be regulated as fission. It should be regulated from a radiological materials and safety perspective. That's how fusion research machines have been regulated for decades in the US. And so right now we're seeing kind of two parallel tracks in the US. One is within the NRC, they are developing the formalized regulatory text to implement the commissioner's decision. And there is also pending legislation in Congress to formalize and codify that approach. So it's quite an exciting time in the US, and it actually, you know, has been informed by the UK experience, I know Sally has presented in NRC over in public meetings over the years. A number of other international jurisdictions have offered their perspective. So I really think that the US is a good example of the emerging harmonization in the regulatory space, which is going to be critically important for all the reasons that Sean and Richard and Sally have mentioned.
If we should rate, I mean, this is not, what is it, Idol? Is that what's called in English? In Swedish it's Idol, the program where you have a jury that rates performances. If we should rate different countries now in performance when it comes to regulatory and fusion, you mentioned, I mean, Japan, UK, you mentioned US, Sweden is like, we won't get even 1 point right now, not even Norway, Denmark either, but Canada, you mentioned to me earlier, was something interesting happening there as well, just a few weeks ago.
Just last week,
yeah.
During Fusion Day in Canada, it was announced that the Canadian authorities will regulate fusion as apart from fission. We should expect a position paper later this summer to describe that. Quick note, I wasn't there. This is hearsay from one of my colleagues who was there. So, you know, take that with a grain of salt until you see it in writing, but Canada certainly seems to be trending in the harmonized direction that the US, UK are starting to trailblaze. Germany, Japan, other jurisdictions seem to be moving that direction as well.
I'll go to you then, Sally, because General Fusion is cooperating with you at Column, for example. You have a cooperation. How would you rate the countries then that we mentioned, or is somebody that should be mentioned that has a great regulatory system in place?
I don't think I'm going to rate them because that will always cause problems,
yeah.
but I mean, perhaps to talk about how we are collaborating.
We can have Simon Powell doing that here.
yeah.
Okay, yeah.
But what I can say is the communities that we have, that we're working internationally. Now, the International Atomic Energy Authority Agency, IAEA, has been really key on this. We've been working for 5 or 6 years as a group of nations, largely from the nations that are obviously developing fusion, the ones that have large laboratories and now sort of big private industries. So we've been working to bring together the people that have experience of working on large fusion plant or design large fusion plant, for example, ITER, to bring in the experience of regulation there to show those. For anybody that does want to delve into a bit more the international arena, there's the IEA World Fusion Outlook that was published last year that tells you not only what they're doing in science but what they're doing in regulation. So that work is ongoing with various organisations and countries contributing. Agile Nations was a group that was set up last year that involved both Japan and Canada, and that's kind of almost the first perhaps international decision. There were some recommendations there about looking at harmonisation, looking at studies into hazard potential. So we kind of have, we almost need a working group of working groups. There are that many, everybody wants to touch regulation, which is really fantastic. And I think what we're seeing is everybody kind of coming along the same way. We're looking to harmonise the framework. Every nation will have its own regulations that will have to fit into its existing scenarios, but what we're hoping is there's some agreement of how to regulate and how you get there on that journey. Can we help new nations who haven't had any fusion involvement in the future to understand how to go on that journey? So, yeah, no league table, but there's many players in the team there.
Do we need, Richard said Simon Powell here, no other comparisons, but do you think that, do we need a harmonisation, and to which level then?
Okay, so I think probably taking a step back first, I would say that fusion being a different technology and countries having different regulatory setups anyway, so different legal processes and so on, it's going to be impossible to say this is how we're going to regulate fusion in country X and then be able to just transport that across the world and say this is how it's going to be done. But I think you can go on the same fundamental principles, and if we're all dealing from the same data set or singing off the same hymn sheet, that's where we need to get to, I think. And there are a couple of things in fusion that make it special, so I'll dive into a few of those if you'll allow. So the first is that fusion, whilst not fission, does still have challenges, and there are risks we have to take care of, and safety is about regulation is about, it's a means to achieve safety by saying we have to protect the environment and the public. So things like release limits for tritium from a fusion power plant, which, by the way, tritium is one of the interesting things in fusion because it gets everywhere. It's hydrogen, it's actually super heavy hydrogen, and this is our fuel. This is what we need to maintain a stockpile of, an inventory of, so that we can say, actually, we now have enough to fuel our reaction. But making sure we know where that is important, and making sure everyone's set the same bar So regulators around the world have to work together to say, this is where we're setting the bar and this is why. That's data driven. If you say to companies like my company, we're running tritium experiments right now, and we're saying, okay, we need to know what you're thinking, and we can also inform you to inform your own thinking, and then other groups will do the same. A regulator can take all the information independently and say, we've looked at the data, we can now make a decision on this. Then they can share that outwardly. So I think that's how we achieve harmonization. It's starting from those same principles and then working upwards from there. And I'm not going to rank them as much as you might want me to. They're going to turn this into Eurovision, right? With the points. I don't watch Eurovision except last year, which was quite good actually. So I might do that again next year. But so the UK, I think right now, very quickly came out of the blocks and said, we are going to regulate this differently. So I think that's probably, it's not ranking it as such, because I think other countries are now following suit, but it is to say the UK got out there early and said, this is the way we're going to do it. And as I said earlier, it's risk informed. It's allowing what, and actually I think I discussed with Bob and Dennis about 7 years ago now. I think Dennis described it as an innovation sandbox, basically saying, don't put the shackles on us now. If you need to regulate us in a certain way because something is a safety critical system, the high pressure systems are going to be commonplace in a fusion plant, then that's fine later, but don't do that now until we've done the experiments, until we know that's going to be the case. Otherwise, you're going to stop us from actually innovating.
Is there, look, I mean, you're new in fusion, thanks, Sean, a reflection on what Richard just said. I mean, you've been in infrastructure for over 20, 30 years. What is your reflection now, being the new kid on the block, when you hear this?
Yeah, I think building on what Richard just said there as well is that someone has to take that first step. Yeah. And I think the UK has done that. And if you're sat in any other nation around the world, you're not going to then restrict your industry by saying we're going to put a lot more regulation on than another country is. So there's a bit of competition in there about where we get to. So people will look to the UK and say, they've decided this, let's investigate that, because we don't want to put our own industry at a disadvantage by putting another level of regulation on it. I think regulation for me sits at all sorts of different levels. And I think when we talk about harmonisation, I think we can talk about global harmonisation, but I think we also need to talk within geographies. You know, my interest is in actually building these plants. That's what really excites me about being at this point in the pivot of where I think fusion is. We're now actually starting to think about building plants. And the key for me is how do we build those plants quickly, efficiently and safely, and then replicate them quickly? Because and I'll use an example from a parallel industry, is I spent a couple of years working on HS2. Now HS2 is a very different thing to fusion, but we went through a number of local authorities, as a train line tends to do. Every local authority wanted something different. Yeah. They wanted something different from it. So the amount of time and effort that was then expended in allowing that to continue was huge and great inefficiency. So when we talk about regulation, I think about things like planning as well, and saying actually we need to get to a point where we have a planning standard for these plants that means that actually we can replicate them around the UK. I'm not even talking about other geographies, quickly and efficiently, rather than having to go through a hugely laborious planning cycle every time we want to build these plants. So I think the key for me as well is looking at regulation at every single level. We sort of think at one stage at one level, but regulation filters down to every part of a successful project delivery. It's about, you know, first off, it being economically viable to do it and not being restricted in terms of where we want to get to. It's then about having a supply chain that understands the regulation that applies to what they do, and they can then provide the equipment and the support that they need to do to fit into that environment. It's then about installation. You know, let's be honest, we're talking about safety and regulation here. You know, there is as many people get injured and killed in construction as they do in operation, and therefore we need to make sure we can construct, test and commission these plants safely as well. And regulation's got a really important role to play in all of that. And then ultimately, as I said before, is those people in the blue overalls that are actually operating this plant understand why regulation plays its part. And I think we've got all of those different levels to think about. And at the moment, we're probably at that stage where we're thinking it right at the top. The bit that really excites me over the next few years is how we break that down. We break it down into bite-sized chunks that suppliers can understand, that manufacturers can understand, and think, actually, I can play in this space. I know how to win in this space, because that's what, you know, everyone is thinking, how do I win in this space? And therefore, if I understand regulation, we have that consistency of approach at a strategic level, as you said, Richard, is we've got suppliers who think, this is a market I want to come into. And having seen on the opposite side of that, where fission has been, I saw some great suppliers walk away from that industry because it was just too darn hard to work in it. And we want the best suppliers in this space, and we've got to make this attractive against everything else that they do. You know, a lot of the equipment will come from people who are traditionally in pet chem, pharmaceuticals, etc. We've got to make this industry attractive rather than somewhere that's hard to work, and I think regulation's got a really important role in that.
What you're all talking about now, and that's what attracted me into this industry as well, is this could be you representing the biggest industry there might be in the world. You were first lawyer in it, so quite good choice. But from your perspective then, what is lacking when you look at the US has done a lot, Canada, we see UK, what do you see from your perspective is really lacking right now for regulatory and policies for the industry? What is the most urgent need right now?
As far as an urgent need, I think some lived experience. You know, we're talking in somewhat academic abstractions about regulation, frameworks and you know, draft regulatory text, but where the rubber meets the road is implementation over time. That will help build community trust, that will help grow the supply chain. It will help give other stakeholders like the investment, insurance industry confidence in an industry like this. And that is actually something that we're working on at CFS. You know, one of the, we're building Spark. It's a tokamak, as we've seen on the videos earlier today. It's functionally a big magnetic donut that will house and use deuterium and tritium fuel. Well, that requires a radiological materials license. Our license is a first of a kind that we are prosecuting right now with the relevant state regulator. That is some lived experience that is going to inform and provide precedent to a lot of our peers in the US. It will provide some experience for us to take to other jurisdictions around the world. So I really think that that is going to be a very short-term benefit of ourselves and some of our peers across the fusion industry to really provide some experience. And you know, as one bit of experience that we've already lived, to Sean's point on the supply chain, you know, we approached a supplier for an electrical switch some years back, and they said, well, how are you going to be regulated? And at the time, the NRC in the US had not made a formal decision. And they said, well, yeah, if you're going to be regulated like fission, we're just not going to take that journey of discovery with you. We're not doing that. Well, the NRC decided to cleave between fission and fusion, and that supplier got comfortable with working with us on a materials safety focus. So we're already starting to de-risk some of these human factors, some of the regulatory safety things, and it's that experience that's going to really start to carry the day forward for us, I think.
Sally, I have to give you, I mean, Valerie told me, Jameson here, said you're actually one of the world's foremost experts on fusion regulations. When you hear these discussions, I mean, if we talk about also, we haven't touched that really, but energy justice, how can regulation support that? And hijacking into what Mike just said, what are your reflections?
Yeah, I mean, there are many of us working on regulation now, not just me, obviously. I think perhaps one of the things that was touched on just now was about planning. Energy justice partly is about making sure that you can bring the benefits of, in this case, of fusion energy to that community. So we want to perhaps consider where you can locate fusion plants and, understand how that can be kind of put into planning regulations. So we hope that they will be open-sighted. Now, you need some criteria. Some of these plants will be very large. They'll be very different scales. Some will be small. Some will be very physically large. So you want to make sure that any planning process, make sure you consider the criteria about land use, water use, habitats and things like that. So you want to make sure that you can locate it in the communities where they can benefit from it. You want to make sure that you're giving a fair chance to all fusion technologies. They are very different. So any regulations, whether it be safety, environment planning, has to ensure that you can cover all those different types of technologies and be graded. You don't want to put the highest standard on everybody or the lowest standard on everybody. So I think understanding the fairness across different technologies is important there as well. So I think, land use and land use planning is one of the important things that needs to be thought about so that we can really bring the benefits to communities. The STEP project, UKAEA STEP project, has identified a site a year or two ago.
Tell us more about STEP, the ones
yes,
who are not
I'm
familiar
sure
with
you'll hear about that throughout the day. So that is the UKAEA's programme to design a prototype fusion power plant. It will be a spherical tokamak using DT fuel. The site was chosen from that through open competition last year, and it will be located in Nottinghamshire, not on the Culham site where there is that current sort of cluster of fusion activity in Oxfordshire. So already it's looking to bring fusion, but not just that fusion energy plant, but all that industry around it. We've talked about the fact that you'll need to manufacture targets or magnets, so there's a whole industry that it's going to bring to a region as well. And talking about sort of education and employment, there are sessions here today about that. We've already heard how important it is to get the next generation of fusion engineers, scientists, a whole range of things to bring that to communities as well. So a very wide range of things, and I think we'll hear this afternoon a little bit more thoughts on energy justice.
Yeah, we will hear more about it, I hope, here today at the Science Museum. If you online have more questions, I have two that have arrived already that I would like to ask you guys, but if anyone in the audience, raise your hand now if you have a question for the panel. And yes, we're getting a microphone there, but before that, Richard, I would like to ask you, you really represent, I would say, a very international company. You work with the UK, you have Japan. What is your view now? I asked Mike about what is the most urgent when it comes to regulation. What do you see? And then we take your question.
I don't know if I've got an answer to the most urgent, but I think one thing that hasn't been discussed perhaps is the role of the public here as a sort of end user. Yes, we have to take care of the environment as well, and that's a given, but I think also it's about the people in the environment. So what I normally say is when people say, what's it like in Japan when you talk about fusion regulation? Well, there's one key difference in Japan is that the public know the word tritium already. Tritium and Fukushima are coupled together because it span out of control, frankly speaking. The way that it was pitched, that Fukushima had this certain amount of tritium in the water, and now the public have a general aversion, a caution towards tritium. So when we're talking about tritium and annual release from fusion power plants, we've got to be very careful and very, very appropriate about saying what the level of risk is. And there'll be an element of rebuilding trust around fusion. But I think it's in that regard, let me pivot a little bit to an analogy of, I think we need to start looking at fusion like the aviation industry. There are a huge number of regulations every time. Many of you probably flew here, those of you who are international guests. In fact, of course, I imagine you flew in, and certainly Mike did as well. You would have got on a plane, and that plane will be being monitored in so many different ways. If you're wearing your seatbelt, there are companies that have to comply with certain regulations about exactly how tight that has to be. They have to go through the safety demonstration every single time you get on the plane, even though you've seen it a million times before, etc. And then, I think I discussed before with former NRC commissioner in the US, Jeff Merrifield, who's been working in a real trailblazer in the regulatory side of things in the US. He said to me, think of fusion like a jet engine. When something goes awry, when something's being done by a pilot or indeed by some fault on a jet engine, the manufacturer and the airline and the regulator all get a signal saying something's happening here, something's going on that's off normal. And what we've got there then is that over decades been built up as a means to basically provide safety through regulation. And I think if we look at industries like the aviation industry for inspiration, and indeed for how to do things from a process point of view, I think we'll end up with actually garnering public trust, because people trust flying. It's one of the safest industries in the entire world, despite being a big metal tin flying in the sky, which tends to scare people inherently.
More scary than fusion reactors, I think.
I think fusion's not scary at all. I think the nuclear industry, by the way, for what it's worth, does a very good job of providing safety. Let's be clear about that. The nuclear industry is incredibly safe. Most industries that are regulated heavily, like the aviation industry, like the nuclear industry, and like fusion will be, in the right way that's proportionate to the risk, will be safe. Full stop.
We could stop the panel. Thank you very much. No, but we need to hear the question from the audience. What's your name and what's your question? There's another question there behind as well, 2 rows back. Yeah.
Good afternoon. Thank you very much for the interesting comments. Malcolm Parry from Hogan Lovells. I'm also a lawyer, unfortunately. Sorry about that. My question
There's
is,
2 of you in the world now.
well, indeed,
Oh,
yeah.
okay.
There are a few.
Good to
there are a
know.
few of us now. I want to touch on a couple of other areas, not just the plants themselves, but which we haven't touched on. One is fuel fabrication, and when you bring concentrations of radioactive material together, there's inherently a risk. And the second is end-of-life decommissioning, and whether we think regulation is currently fit for purpose, whether things need to change for those areas as well.
Who wants to pick it up? Sally?
I can pick up the back end of that.
Yeah.
So decommissioning. So the jet fusion device at Culham stopped operations just before Christmas and is now entering decommissioning. Now, the future power plants might well have a lot more tritium than that, some of the large ones, some of them won't. So what we're doing now at Culham is using that decommissioning of jet, which has had deuterium and tritium experiments and therefore, an activated material such. So using that as almost a test bed for physically how do we decommission them. But also that is being regulated as the rest of the Culham site is under the existing regulations for radiation. So it is just radiation. Obviously tritium has different properties than many others. It's much lower radiotoxicity, but it's much more mobile. So thinking about the safety side, that's fine, that's been regulated as is. Thinking about stuff like radioactive waste, there's a lot of experimental facilities at Culham that are also looking at reducing the amount of radioactive waste by, for example, extracting the tritium, which is a valuable resource, to reuse that. So we are starting to get experience already in decommissioning and also the regulatory side of managing that as well. So that started with the end question of that. Now you've got the beginning side of the fuel fabrication.
Else want to pick up on the beginning? Sean, you look eager. Or Mike?
I think we probably don't know the answers to the questions is probably the best way to start that answer. But if I compare, we are trying to distance ourselves a little bit from fission, but there is still some really great lessons from fission regulation, and we need to pick the right pieces of that. So from my time on Hinckley, part of our site license had to be how we were going to decommission. We had to have the funding in place to allow us to decommission. We had to have a financial vehicle in place to ensure that the decommissioning of that plant will not become a burden on the society at the time it comes into that. So I think there's a huge positive pieces we can learn from other parts of regulation, but it's something I think needs to be built in. I think we're at the early stages, I think, to be quite candid. But we need to build that into things like site licenses, operations, so that actually we are thinking about the end and we're not leaving, as we have done with some existing fission plants, a burden that the society at that point in time has to live with without planning that in advance. So there is some great lessons, I think, from fission in terms of that side of things. But as I say, we're learning how to do that at the moment. So I think regulation will be playing a little bit of catch up at the moment.
We started late. I know there's a panel I'm going to lead at 12 about. You mentioned it earlier, the power plant building, which you need to attend to. But one more question, I think, behind you that before we let go, you guys, and hope you find your way to other panels from here as well. Yep.
Hi, Jane Hotchkiss. I'm here from across the pond, along with many others here from the US. And I came to Fusion from power development, from renewables specifically. But so my question is going to be, who is responsible? I mean, there's so many things that we could put for first. Let's get the regulations right first, and then we'll build. Let's get the engineering fully understood, then we'll go forward. So there's a chicken and egg confusion here of we need all of it, and we talk about parallel lines. But the one thing I haven't seen first and foremost is asking the public. So it's not just engaging the public because you want something. It's about where are they right now? So what are their priorities for safety, for the future of their children? For how do they rank them? It doesn't mean don't tell them about the safety issues of fusion, but it does mean where are their reflections reflected in the way we engage first.
Thank you. And I think this is a really interesting question, because I just mentioned I was not nice to my own home country, Sweden, but we have to educate as part of the fusion industry. We are educating the public through media, general media, etc. right now. But what are your reflections? Floor's open. Mike? Yeah?
Sure. Just maybe addressing that question in two ways. One, Jane, I fully take your point that there's a broader context, right? Like, and people, once they understand the technology in the general sense, they can start to balance the equities of climate and their own children's future and things like that. And safety is an important part of that, and that's an important story to tell. I did want to put a fine point on something that came up a couple of minutes ago, that fusion is safe, and it is the entire industry's responsibility to keep it that way. And so we do not think that competing on safety is in anyone's best interest. So that's why we think that a regulatory framework that accommodates all types of fusion is an appropriate direction. And to the second part of Jane's question, we have some lived experience with our own Spark siting process and bringing local community members to our facility quite regularly. We had an open and public process for the environmental siting of Spark in Massachusetts. That included site walks with local environmental groups, to the formalized consultation period for our environmental authorization. So I definitely do not want the impression to be left that we are putting public acceptance, public endorsement, public demand for this technology on the back burner. In fact, it's at front of mind and permeates a lot of our decision making.
I think just going to add a little bit to that, and you briefly, Sally, touched upon STEP. I think STEP is a pivot point, particularly in the UK. We have a site, we have a community we are now going to work with, and I think STEP is going to be, I certainly hope it is anyway, it's going to be that pivot point where this becomes much more public. We're going to have to communicate with and we want to communicate, but we've got to have a message, and we've got to have something tangible, because I think sometimes people get bombarded with information, and where is it? How do I feel it? Can I see it? Is there anything there? So I think the STEP program in the UK particularly is going to be that pivot point for that public engagement, which you've already had a little bit with Spark, but that'll be our pivot point, I think, in the UK.
We do a last question. Do you want to say something there, Richard?
I was just going to add that the perception of risk and the general public, it's hard for them to understand the risks of fusion. So I think a regulator needs to be independent both of the public and of the industry to a degree, that it says, I'm hearing from both sides, I'm hearing these concerns, but they have to be risk informed. If someone said, I'm scared of X, but it's completely unfounded, the regulator can't go, well, we need to make sure we've catered to that particular. There needs to be instead dialogue and good communication transparently between everyone, and I think that's how you achieve that.
We take one question. I know we're over time, so somebody has to tell me to stop so I can run to the next one. But there's one question I really want us, it's come up a few times. They want examples of major energy projects that we can be inspired of in the fusion industry when it comes to infrastructure, etc., given the fact that we need to speed up and be much faster than other industries right now. Role model for energy projects, those kind of questions.
Not necessarily energy, but I would have said people tend to, myself included, cite SpaceX, gigafactories, AI right now. If you look at these industries that are trying to scale fast, I mean, by the way, I say AI, you're all thinking AI. Hang on, that's not a tangible real thing. No, they're building data centers, massive data centers at mass scale, like they've never done before.
But the adopting process.
Yeah, I think that, but then that comes with demand, and I think it was. there was a famous scientist, Lev Artsimovich, who said fusion will be ready when society needs it, and I think I understand more and more about this.
That's a good end to the panel.
There's
Say
more.
It again.
So fusion will be ready when society needs it, and the way I interpret that, what he meant, but I think he said it in 1972, by the way. So this has been around for a long time. Let's be clear about that. When he said that, I think what he meant was there has to be a genuine need for it and a demand to someone who wants it, and I think we're getting towards that right now.
We are, and this society should be ready now. And if you have more questions of these amazing panelists, can they walk up to you and take a coffee after this?
Absolutely.
If they don't go to my panel.
If they bring the coffee to me.
If they bring coffee, give them a warm hand. Thank you so much. Thank you. And thank you online for listening. And more panels to go today at the Science Museum. Thank you.